Hi. I'm going to keep my remarks very brief because I believe that the introduction should be at least better than the lecture, and that if I were to say all the nice things that I know about John, that wouldn't be the case. And I'm here just to point out that he is not celebrated only for being Mary Felstiner's husband, as some of the people who have saw Mary's lecture in the past might think. He Stanford University since 1965 and now teaches English and Jewish studies there. He has also taught at the University of Chile, the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and Yale University. His book, Translating Neruda, The Way to Machu Picchu, won the Commonwealth Club Gold Medal in 1981. John served actually with me for a time on the board of directors of the Holocaust Center of Northern California. Was there when I got there as the executive director. And for a period of time, he was the only individual who bought duplicate books. We had probably hundreds, maybe thousands over the years of books that people donated that we already had, and we arranged to have them go to university libraries. This library at Sonoma State University, probably the #1 recipient of those books. Most of the books about the Holocaust in your library came from there. And I thought these books were going to the Stanford Library. And when I found out that in fact one person was buying and reading these books, I asked the vice president of the Holocaust Center, a gentleman named Isaac Sevi, who didn't consider himself a scholar. He only spoke 6 languages and pretty much had read all of the books that I was passing on to John. And I said, is this the right thing to do? Should we be giving it? And the other thing, Isaac Sevi was not overly impressed with professors. He heard a lot of lectures. He had a lot of questions. He'd read most of the books the professors had read. And I said, shouldn't these be going into the library? He said, Felstiner's a good one. Better he should have the books. I don't think there's any statement of praise that anyone could say stronger about John Felstiner than to have Isaac Sevi say he's a good one. John Felstiner.
Thanks so much, Joel, and thanks, Philip. Just before I get going, I wanted to remind you that there is a handout, and I've noticed that when one puts a chair with handouts on it, people will go through fire and brimstone and into the jaws of death to make their way around the chair without picking up the handout, as someone just did. So if you don't have one, maybe Joel could. I know there are people who've come in and didn't get them. And I think there are more on the chair there if you want to just walk over towards the chair or whatever. So, I do want to thank Joel Newberg so much for his words. I go back almost 20 years now with the Holocaust Center of Northern California. And I want to thank Philip Beard for bringing me here, and especially want to thank the Alliance that you're a part of. I know how much work and really support go into it, and how much it needs the community partly represented here, and that has made it such an unusual and such a precious presence. Highly unusual. I'm envious and wish we had something like it at Stanford. I'm going to begin right away in a somewhat dangerous way. I'm going to begin with a poem instead of a lot of generalities. I'm going to begin with a poem. I think this poem will help demonstrate, because it embodies a very certain need. It embodies the need really the urgency, the difficulty, really the near impossibility of speaking the unspeakable, of witnessing to genocide, to mass death. It embodies one way, and for me, piercing and true way of resisting that which would stifle the individual voice and would efface personhood. The poem I'm going to begin with is by Paul Celan, and you see his face up there a few years after he wrote this poem. You don't have the poem in front of you, but don't worry about that for now. The poem is called With a Changing Key, mit wechselndem Schlüssel. And what I'll do is read the poem in English first, and then let you hear Paul Celan's voice speaking it. And then I want to talk about the last two lines of this short poem, which you do have in front of you. So our poem, and you won't find it on your page, so don't look for it there, you can just listen to it. With a changing key, you unlock the house where the snow of what's silenced drifts. Just like the blood that bursts from your eye or mouth or ear, so your key changes. Changing your key changes the word that may drift with the flakes. Just like the wind buffs you, the snow packs around the word. Now, I'll say a couple of things about that poem. I know it's hard to absorb poetry right off the bat, or even if you have it in the page and have known it for 20 years, it's still hard. But let me say a couple of things about it. The key, I think, is something that the poet needs to, as he says, unlock the house where the snow of what's silenced drifts. And that would be the house of his experience, the house of his psyche. The snow silenced would be the oppressive, fatal vanishing of the things that mattered most to him. So he's speaking to himself, but I think he's also ultimately speaking to us. Changing your key changes the word. That is to say, if you can adjust yourself to what the poet is saying, you may be able to receive that word yourself. I think I'll read it once more in English and then let you hear his voice and then talk about it some more. With a changing key, you unlock the house where the snow of what's silenced drifts. Just like the blood that bursts from your eye or mouth or ear, so your key changes. Changing your key changes the word that may drift with the flakes. Just like the wind that rebuffs you, the snow packs around the word. Celan never talked about his poetry, he just rustled papers.
Mit wechselndem Schlüssel. Mit wechselndem Schlüssel schließt du das Haus auf, darin der Schnee des Verschwiegenen treibt. Je nach dem Blut, das dir quillt, aus Aug oder Mund oder Ohr, wechselt dein Schlüssel. Wechselt dein Schlüssel, wechselt das Wort, das Treiben darf wirken. Je nach dem Wind, der dich fortstößt, bald das Wort sich der Schnee.
Put the last two lines on your handout. I hope everybody can look at it because I want to talk about them for a little while now, and I have various reasons for doing that. Primary among them to try to get a grip on this poem, but other reasons too. When he speaks about the wind, I think Celan means what poets often mean, something brutal, something overwhelming, something perhaps fatal. When he speaks about the snow, he means perhaps what people have often meant by snow. I think, for instance, of Emily Dickinson, who has, amongst many others, one perfect poem called After Great Pain, a Formal Feeling Comes, and that poem ends this way. as freezing persons recollect the snow, first chill, then stupor, then the letting go. Emily Dickinson. As persons recollect the snow, first chill, then stupor, then the letting go. So it's always been there, snow has, as an image of the end of things, the sinking of the sap, the cold bottom and end of life. Celan had all that in mind, but he had a very particular sense of it in mind too, namely that both his parents in 1942 were driven east across a river in Eastern Europe to a Nazi Romanian work camp, or work to the point of death, and then his father died of typhus and his mother was shot when she was no longer, as the Germans said, arbeitsfähig, capable of work. And so the snow in that Ukrainian winter, when both his parents died, kept for him an utterly baneful force. So what's going on now in these last two lines? Je nach dem Wind, der dich fortstößt, bald das Wort sich der Schnee, which would mean just insomuch as the wind which pushes you away balls up itself, packs up, clenches into a fist around the word, the snow. In other words, the snow packs or clenches or balls itself up around the word. Now, you probably heard in my last reading of the couplet as it stands in my book that it's different on the handout in front of you. And even then, early this morning, I got up and spent a long time to make it even better, and I'm not at all happy with it now. Why have I worked so long on it? That's one of my ulterior questions. It's because I think everything we need to know is contained in these two lines. And I could conceivably spend the rest of the time allotted just by looking at them, but I'll try not to do quite that. I think what he's saying here is that he's trying to make somehow his experience tally with his poetry. His physical, actual lived experience, just like the wind that rebuffs you, tally with his vocation, his need to speak about his experience. Clenched round your word comes the snow. Now, I could have a much more rational translation of those lines. Just like the wind that rebuffs you, just like the wind that rebuffs you, snow packs around your word. That's the rational English way of doing it. But something else is happening in that last line that I think we can't do without, and that happens only in poetry. The wind that rebuffs you. And then what he does in the last line is to center the word word, which says everything for him. It's his whole mission, his whole vocation. The only thing that Paul Celan had left after the Holocaust, and this is not an exaggeration, was language, German language. Parents, homeland, culture, religion, friends, profession, material goods, everything way. That's all he had left, and he literally put it on his back in a knapsack when he fled. He fled west of Vienna and ultimately to Paris, where he settled after the war as a survivor. So right in the middle of that line comes the word snow, comes the word word, and yet that word is encompassed and really overwhelmed by the verb clenched, ballen, if you like, and the word snow. Determined, I am determined to get my line arranged in such a way so that I hold on to that same kind of almost deep wisdom that a line of poetry can bring you. The deep wisdom that speech itself, the human voice, has been practically overwhelmed, almost overwhelmed by the affliction, the circumstances, the things standing around it. So, just like the wind that rebuffs you, and I can't find the right word for ballen. I thought of clot and cling and cake and mold and choking and shrouding and swathing and baffling and bulking and all sorts of words, trying to work them in, because what I also want here is exactly the same rhythm. Because if poetry lives, it lives by the voice and the rhythm. Listen to the way that line moves just for the rhythm. Je nach dem Wind fortstößt, bald das Wort sich der Schnee. 3 powerful beats in each line over and over again. If I've missed that, I have lost touch with Ceylon. And what, as a biographer and a translator and an interpreter and in a sense, a spokesperson for him, a witness to him, what I try to do is stay as close to his voice as I can. Just like the wind that rebuffs you, clenched round your word comes the snow. At least I have the rhythm, the verb where I want it, and I have the word in the middle, and I have the snow at the end of the line. So perhaps I'll let that poem rest for just a moment now and move on to some larger questions before I come back to Ceylon and other poets. My title, the title that Philip very actually cannily gave to me and that I'm quite satisfied with, is Poetry and Resistance. But as you've seen on the handout, I have a question mark after it in my truer moments. What is that conjunction "and" doing there? How can poetry on the one hand, lyric poetry especially, which is the instance and the index of everything which is most joyous and harmonic and accomplished and spiritually transcendent in human life, how can poetry on the one hand be conjoined in the simple conjunction "and" with resistance, which is everything that is most dire and, you might say. And so I might fool around with the title a little bit, but only to go in stronger directions rather than weaker directions, and say poetry as resistance, or even poetry is resistance. And so it'll be part of my task this afternoon to justify such a strong title, such a strong phrase to you. I don't mean to say that poetry is the same as, or to be confused with, other resistance. And I know you had a lecture last week, and then perhaps from Nechama Tech, I don't know what she spoke about, but it probably had something to do with other kinds of resistance. I don't know. You can tell me. So I don't mean to say that poetry is the same as armed resistance, although often they meet in the same person. Well, sometimes they meet in the same person. Armed resistance, such as was present, such as occurred at Warsaw and Sobibor and Auschwitz camps, such as occurred in the ghettos and in the forests with partisans and other resistors in Poland and Russia especially. There were other kinds of active physical resistance besides that. Couriers who moved in and out of the ghetto, saboteurs, people who would ambush or blow up a troop train or whatever. Rescuers of Jews, whether they were non-Jews or Jews themselves, people who refused orders at peril of life, people who concealed Jews at risk during the Holocaust. Many forms of armed and active resistance, which would be another allied topic entirely. Something else called spiritual resistance is also spoken of. And I take spiritual resistance either to mean everything that's not physical, or more particularly, adherence to one's religion. Some to pray or celebrate the feast days or the Sabbath under the least propitious conditions ever. Spiritual resistance, adhering to one's religion. It didn't make all the difference, but sometimes without it, survival might have been more impossible than it actually was. Another phrase that is sometimes used is cultural resistance, and I'll give you a few examples of that. For instance, in Berlin, in Germany, something was formed called the Kulturbund, the Alliance for Culture, or the League for Culture, and Charlotte Solomon, whom you heard about from my wife Mary last year, and her stepmother survived under that for a little while. That is, employ Jewish artists while you can, even with the connivance of the Nazis. In Vilna, Terezin, in Czechoslovakia, and in many, many other places in Europe, Nazi-occupied Europe, there's education for children and for adults of all sorts, the whole spectrum, even more intense than would have occurred in peacetime. And so education under those conditions is a form of cultural resistance. We can talk about this later if you want. In Warsaw, there were the great Oneg Shabbat archives of Emanuel Ringelblum. I might mention those later. Another form of resistance, to keep an archive. There was one in the Lvov ghetto also. Everywhere throughout Nazi-occupied Europe, people kept diaries. We, of course, know about Anne Frank, but she's only the tip of the pyramid. For instance, Ringelblum, in the beginning of this unique, precious document called Notes from the Warsaw Ghetto, Ringelblum, who died when the ghetto was liquid, says, everyone was writing. Journalists and writers, of course, but also teachers, public men, young people, even children. Most of them kept diaries where the tragic events of the day were reflected through the prism of personal experience. A tremendous amount was written, but the vast majority of the writings was destroyed with the annihilation of Warsaw Jewry during the resettlement days. All that has remained is the material we have preserved in our ghetto archive. It's not quite true, other things survived, but mainly that's true. And yet I'm struck by his saying everyone was writing, including children. So remember that if you're ever a doubt as to whether it's worthwhile to keep a journal or a diary. Not that such things are going to happen in this country, but it's worthwhile. You'll know that, I'm sure, as soon as you do it. Another term that I want to bring in, which is not quite so well known as spiritual and cultural resistance, would be creative resistance. And I'm coming a little closer now to the heart of my inquiry today. Creative resistance took all sorts of forms. Song of all sorts. I've just come from a symposium that took me some months to organize at Stanford called Music and the Holocaust, and I won't try to boil that down into the next minute except to say that songs, especially folk songs, parodies of older folk songs brought up to date in order to reflect the conditions around them, flourished in all the ghettos. Music in general, where it could occur, did occur. Art, photography, and poetry. An example would be Lotta Solomon, who painted her autobiography in pictures while she was in hiding on the French Riviera just before the Nazis came in. I'm going to give you another example. Here's a picture by a man named Felix Bloch from Terezin, Theresienstadt, the Czech, where Jewish life could flourish for a little while. It's a string quartet. I'm particularly taken by a composer who lived for a little while in the Terezin ghetto, a young man named Gideon Klein. Gideon Klein was only in his 20s when he entered the Terezin ghetto, and he did all kinds of things while he was there. He organized choirs for the children, concerts for the many musicians that were there. He composed, and I've brought a little sample of his music while you look at that drawing, although it's a trio, not a quartet. He composed many things while he was there. 9 days, or perhaps even fewer, a few days before he himself was shoved onto a transport to Auschwitz and perished there like most of the others in Terezin. A few days before, he wrote a trio, a string trio. And I know you can't, but this is a transparency of the actual autograph manuscript of the trio. Here's what it sounds like. Here's the slow movement from that string trio, composed but never performed in Terezin. The slow movement embodies a Moravian folk song that his nanny used to sing to him when he was young, and you can see why that in particular would have meant something to him. I said that poetry happened against all the odds. Terezin, children wrote poems and drew pictures. Some of you may be familiar with this book called I Never Saw Another Butterfly. I was reminded of it when I saw a butterfly on the flyer for this concert series, and I don't know whether that's what was in people's minds, but luckily I was reminded of this book. Here's a poem which was written by a young child, anonymous now, because only the poem was discovered afterwards, called Concert in the Old School Garret, played by Gideon Klein. I won't read the whole poem, just a couple of lines. And so evidently this child was at such a concert by Gideon Klein, who was also a great pianist, and put this into the poem. Under closed eyes, he seeks among the keys, as among the veins through which the blood flows softly when you kiss them with a knife and put a song to it. Not the sort you get in the schools these days, thank goodness. So, poetry. Poetry that concerns me, emerging from the Holocaust, was written in two ways, during the Holocaust and after the Holocaust. And I'll be showing you examples of each, but I think it makes a great difference when the poem was written. Poetry written the Holocaust raises for us one of the two central questions. How could people compose lyric poetry then and there? Poetry written after the Holocaust raises for me the other central question that I'm always getting at on a day like this. How can we, not how could they compose, but how can we comprehend what happened through poetry, or as poets if we are doing the writing nowadays? Many people have addressed themselves with more or less wisdom to the question of what poetry and the Holocaust have to do with each other. One of the earliest was a German, somewhat Jewish sociologist named Theodor Adorno, who survived the war years by living somewhat better off in Los Angeles, I think, at the time, but then went back to Germany afterwards and became pretty much the leading German thinker after Heidegger, I suppose. Theodor Adorno famously said, right after the war, and then kept repeating it for many years, nach Auschwitz ein Gedicht zu schreiben ist barbarisch. After Auschwitz, to write a poem is barbaric. This would be something worth talking about later. I think he meant not only after Auschwitz, but about Auschwitz. He certainly meant about Auschwitz, but he also meant after Auschwitz, which is an even more astonishing stricture, is it not? All poetry after Auschwitz, Adorno seemed to be saying, is invalid. Why? He didn't say why, but I think he meant because poetry induces joy, and joy is not to be thought of, that which happened. Poetry would lyric poetry would trivialize, or elevate something which should not be trivialized or elevated, or make banal in some way the disfigure it instead of figuring it. That's what Adorno said, and at some time, I don't know where or when, the German socialist playwright Bertolt Brecht said something else. He had a kind of question-answer, which I've written down for you here. In the dark times, will there also be singing? Yes, there will be singing about the dark times. And that's one way of answering Adorno, because of course people must write almost as much as they must breathe. Not only that, the habit, the response, the ingrained need to compose poetry or song in the face of adversity lies deep within the grain of all peoples that I know of. And certainly in the tradition that I know best, the Jewish tradition, you find it deeply ingrained and embedded there. Just to give two very brief examples, which I've mentioned here, the Psalms, but especially Psalm 137, which you'll recognize as soon as I read verses 1 to 4. It stems from the Babylonian exile, that is, the destruction of Solomon's temple and the exile to Babylon. The destruction of Solomon's temple, of course, is the first event in Jewish mythology or history which carries the term Shoah, S-H-O-A-H in English, widespread devastation, catastrophe. By the rivers of Babylon we sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. For there they that carried us away captive required of us a song, and they that wasted us required of us mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? That's the beginning of Psalm 137. Or the other primary locus of song tree in the face of adversity would be the Book of Lamentations, sometimes called the Lamentations of Jeremiah. And I would invite you to look that up sometime, especially the beginning, which is beautiful in every language, especially Latin, where it's often set to music, and in the King James Version. How doth the city sit solitary? This is about the wasting of Jerusalem. How doth the city sit solitary that was full of people? How is she become as a widow, she that was great among nations? She weepeth sore in the night. Probably sung this in various rounds or other versions. She weepeth sore in the night, and her tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers she has none to comfort her, and so on. So Jerusalem imagined as a woman, utterly desolate, a mourner, a widow. But then something very strange happens a little later in Lamentations, chapter 2, verse 13. Not often remembered as the earlier verses are. The poet asks this, or the prophet asks this, speaking to Jerusalem as a woman, what shall I take to witness? What thing shall I take to witness for thee? What thing shall I liken to thee, O daughter of Jerusalem? It's a strange moment, because what the prophet or poet is asking there is, how can I write poetry about such desolation? What metaphors? What shall I take? What shall I liken you to? What analogies? What metaphors? What shall I equal to thee, that I may comfort thee, O virgin daughter of Zion? Who can heal thee? So there, not only the question of how do we write about catastrophe, but can it possibly have a healing power? It's a very, very risky thought. So deep in Jewish tradition, there is this need and this urgency. Now I want to come a little closer to the heart of my topic, poetry as resistance, and give you what I would call a schema, but I don't kind of like that word, don't even know how to pronounce it, so I'll say a spectrum of poets, and that'll form the core of what I want to leave you with now. But it's a spectrum as to different ways in which these poems come to us. First of all, the time, the year that they come from, whether it's during the war or after, mainly. Secondly, the place. It makes a difference whether it was Terezin or Warsaw or southern France, New York City during the war, or San Francisco after the war. A spectrum as to the time, the place, the conditions, because the conditions for writing poetry, they're never all that good, but they were at their worst between 1933 or 35 or 38 or 39 or 41 and 1945. And so the conditions mean a great deal behind the poem, as they don't always nowadays. And finally, and I've underlined it, language, a spectrum as to the language in which the poems were written. Because poems were written in every language in Nazi-ridden Europe. And that must be something like, however, I don't know, I haven't counted, but let's say 20 different countries or more suffered Nazi oppression, persecution, occupation, and so on. And people were stirred, people were driven to poetry whether or not they were poets to begin with, in all the languages of Europe. But I've chosen 3 languages which I would call, if I could venture the word, privileged languages. I mean it somewhat in the sense that current critical jargon uses the word privilege, but never mind about that. Yiddish, German, and Hebrew are strangely privileged languages for poetry to occur in during this period. And I'll try to say why very briefly and then give you instances. Yiddish, because Yiddish simply means Jewish, and because Yiddish was the ancient, almost millennial language spoken by 3 to 5 million Jews, spoken by the Jews who were most vulnerable in Eastern and Central Europe. Yiddish was the language literally obliterated, the language literally obliterated, torn out of the mouths of those millions of Jews. In fact, it tantamount to what circumcision would mean for a male Jew during the war. It meant you were Jewish. And so Yiddish I take first as the primarily privileged language. Secondly, German. Although it could just as well be Italian or French or Spanish or Ladino, I shouldn't forget about, Bulgarian and Greek and so on up to the number of 20 or so languages. But I've chosen German. Why? Because German, especially for Paul Celan, German was at one and the same time the mother tongue for those Jews who had most successfully assimilated in Central Europe. But at the same time, almost overnight and brutally and atrociously, German became the murderer's tongue. Celan woke up one morning and it was as if he and the language he spoke had been, or rather the language he spoke had been brutally appropriated by master race, to coin terms like Endlösung, which means final solution, or Endlösung zur Judenfrage, which means, always with heavy, heavy quotation marks around it, final solution to the Jewish question, or Kristallnacht, which means night of broken glass, or Judenrein, which means pure of Jews, as in ethnic cleansing. German, therefore, overnight became the murderer's tongue, but it remained the mother tongue for someone like Paul Celan. Therefore, that gives it a very charged, precarious, and yet privileged status. And finally, Hebrew will be my third example. Hebrew because it is the perennial, almost eternal language of the Jewish people, because it is the language of the Bible. It is, in other words, the founding language of the people itself. Hebrew itself comes from the root meaning to cross over, the way Abraham crossed over out of the land of Ur, was it? And Joshua and Moses crossed over into Canaan, and Isaac crossed over the ford, and so on, a crossover people. Hebrew was the founding language for Jews, and at a time Hebrew was the language they might, if they were lucky, save themselves into. Palestine first, and then Israel. The tongue spoken in the country they might, if they were lucky, reach. And so Hebrew has a very saving and precious valence attached to it. So those are the 3 languages. I'll start with Yiddish now and give you some instances of what happened in the Yiddish language. There was a man named Abba Kovner. Here are some pictures of Abba Kovner on the screen. At the top, when he was youngest, he was a partisan, in fact, a leader of a partisan band in the Vilna ghetto. So you see him top right. And right next to him is a young woman named Vitka, who years later became his wife and still lives in Israel, even though Abba has died. And then at the bottom, you see him testifying, I think, at the Eichmann trial. And then on the right, you see him shortly before he died. Abba Kovner used to tell a story. I'm not going to show you a poem by his, because But he used to tell an interesting story about how they defended in the Vilna ghetto. He said at one point they realized that they didn't have any sandbags to mount in the bunkers in order to fight against the Germans who would be attacking those up. And he said, what an irony for the people of sand, of the desert, whose sand was running out in the hourglass, whose seed should have been multiplied as the sands of the sea. What an irony. When they needed sandbags most, they didn't have them. But then he had a thought. He realized that elsewhere in Vilna there was an ancient publishing house and that publishing house published huge volumes of the Talmud and had done so for 200 years. And he realized these huge volumes of the Talmud were almost as big as sandbags and just as impermeable. So what he did was to send people down there, and they, instead of sandbags, buttressed their bunker with volumes of the Talmud being the great books of interpretation and lore of the Jewish tradition. And he seemed to think that that was a fitting form of defense, a kind of cultural and spiritual resistance, if I ever heard of one. That's why he liked the story so much. That's Abba Kovner. He had a friend in Vilna, another poet who was also a partisan called Avraham Sutzkever. And I want to say a word or two about Sutzkever, who is still alive and writing Yiddish poetry in Israel in his 90s. Sutzkever was, as I say, at the same time a poet and a partisan fighter. I came across something about him in a little diary kept by this boy, Yitzhak Rudashevsky, in the Vilna ghetto. Just a little boy named Yitzhak, but he kept a diary in Yiddish. That's a picture of his diary. Can't read much, besides it's in Yiddish. And here's what Yitzhak Rudashevsky says at one point in 1942. Today we had a very interesting meeting in the ghetto with the poet A. Sutzkever. He talked to us about poetry, about art in general, and about subdivisions in poetry. He talked about Yiddish poetry and what is most important, how we should collect ghetto folklore. In the ghetto, dozens of sayings, ghetto curses, and blessings are created before our eyes. And then another time, the young poet A. Sutzkever told us about some other Yiddish poets, truly inspired us. I cite that from the Diary of the Vilna Ghetto by Yitzhak Rudashevsky as just immediate evidence of the way that sometimes cultural resistance in the form of poetry could take place. Here's a poem by Avraham Sutzkever. I'll just read a few lines of it and then let you hear his voice. Because I think it's important to hear a little Yiddish now and then for the reasons that I said. What happened behind this poem is that when Sutzkever realized, as a partisan in the Vilna ghetto, that they didn't have enough lead to make bullets, he had a similar realization to Abba Kovner's. He realized there was a famous printing press that had been printing the Bible and the Talmud also for many years, called the Rome Printing Press. He got the lead plates, which had been used to print the Bible and the Talmud, had them melted down and made into bullets. The lead plates at the Rome press, arrayed at night like fingers stretched through bars to clutch the lit air of freedom, we made for the press plates to seize the lead plates at the Rome printing works. We were dreamers, we had to be soldiers, and melt down for our bullets the spirit of the lead.
Die bleiernen Platten von Roms Druckerei haben wie Finger gestreckte Durchgraten zu fangen die lichtige Luft von der Frei, durch Nase gezeugen zu nehmen die Platten, die bleiernen Platten von Roms Druckerei. Mir Träumer, but
just to give you a sense of his voice. I'll mention Kadja Molodowski, a Yiddish poet who survived outside, but witnessed it and had that umbilical tie that she would have since she was born in Yiddish-speaking Europe, but managed to get to Canada during the war. She wrote a poem called God of Mercy, which begins with a phrase ever present in the Bible and in liturgy, "O God of mercy." It's as close to the lips of any believing person in Catholicism, Christianity, as well as Judaism, as any phrase could be. But listen to the way that phrase turns in her mouth. "O God, for the time being, choose another people." You know, the Jews are known as the chosen people. "We are tired of death. There are no more lamentations nor songs of woe in the ancient texts. God of mercy, sanctify another land, another Sinai. We have paid for each letter in your commandments." So this is how sometimes the founding text, the tradition itself in Yiddish, has to be wrenched, warped out of shape in order to speak a new truth that hadn't been spoken before. I'll mention another Yiddish poet who also lived in New York City during the war, though he was born in Russia, Jacob Glattstein. He wrote a poem, it's called "The Dead Men Don't Praise God," and it begins with using the words Sinai and Lublin. You know what Sinai is, where the law was delivered and the Jewish people set forth. But Lublin is a town in Poland, right where one of the 5 death camps existed, called Majdanek. And so when he says Lublin, Majdanek, and this is the way his poem begins, Jacob Glattstein, "We received the Torah at Sinai, and in Lublin we gave it back." And now, as my final instance of Yiddish poetry, I want to mention Yitzhak Katznelson. I realize these are not household names to conjure with. That's why I'm bringing them up. Katznelson was and the Hebrew poet of the Warsaw Ghetto, Yitzhak Katznelson. He's shown here with his son, Tzvi, during the ghetto period in Warsaw. He composed a poem called "Song of the Murdered Jewish People." Another view of him by an artist named Leah Lilienblum. You would think if it were Picasso or one of the German artists that the figures had been wildly distorted in order to get at some subjacent truth. And I always thought so when I looked at that work of art. Remember, I said there was art. This was done right at the time. But then when I came upon the picture later, I realized that she hadn't had to distort his features in order to get at that, to get that expressionist torque, which tells the kind of truth. In Song of the Murdered Jewish People, which he wrote in a transit camp in France, he does much of what I've been getting at here. He begins his first canto, which is called Sing, this way. "Sing, take your light, hollow harp in hand." Remember Psalm 137? We laid down our harps, we hanged our harps on the willows. "Sing the last song. Sing of the last Jews on Europe's soil. How can I sing? How can I open my lips? A great throng, a huge crowd, oh how huge, far greater than Ezekiel's valley of bones. Can these bones live? Not even a bone remains from my murdered people." Just a couple of excerpts from the poem to show you how Katznelson, at his direst, in his moment of direst need, has recourse to that one source, the Bible. And yet what he has to do is to turn it against itself, to say whatever the covenant, whatever the promise of the Psalms or the Ezekiel, because most of the Psalms do end in praise, no matter how full of lament they are at the beginning. Whatever the promise, the founding text out for us, we can speak our own truth now only by rebutting, saying no to, gainsaying that promise. He wrote that poem, but he knew he might not survive. And so he hid the poem at the foot of one of those trees in the transit camp where he lived. And a woman named Miriam Novich, who published the book I was just reading from and whom I much revere, went after the war around Europe, and she went to the foot of the tree. He had hidden it in a tin canister and found that poem, even though he and his son were slaughtered. The theme that I have been letting emerge from my remarks is one that might have formed a kind of subtitle or topic, and that is the way Scripture, the way the founding text, the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the way Scripture emerges in Holocaust. There's a great moment in Primo Levi's book, and if you haven't read Primo Levi in this course, I urge you to read what is easily the finest memoir to have emerged from the Holocaust, and that's Primo Levi's book. It's called Survival in Auschwitz in paperback, but it was originally called If This Is a Man, Se Questo è un Uomo. He was Italian. In this exceedingly fine memoir, he says at one point how they used to sit around telling stories, sorrowful, cruel, and moving stories, because so are all our stories in Auschwitz. Hundreds of thousands of stories, all different and all full of a tragic, disturbing necessity. We tell them to each other in the evening, and they take place in Norway, Italy, Algeria, the Ukraine, and are simple and incomprehensible, like the stories in the Bible. Isaac, Rebecca, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel. Simple and incomprehensible, like the stories in the Bible, but are they not the stories of a new Bible? Thus Primo Levi. And I take that as the most radical, even blasphemous remark that I have seen about this question of the survival of the Bible during the Holocaust. Namely, that the stories one had to tell became stories of a new Bible, as if Auschwitz had replaced Sinai. I'm going to come to German language now and Paul Celan, and I think I will omit the poem called Psalm for now. This is a picture of Celan in later years. I think I started with one around 1950s, and this is in the 60s, when he became afflicted towards the end of his life for various reasons, psychically, personally. The trauma, the wounds had never healed, never left him. And instead of Psalm, which is a marvelous enough poem in its own way, I'll show you his most famous poem, and the most famous poem to have emerged from the Holocaust in any language. It's called Death Fugue, or Todes Fuge. And what it has to do with is the possibility or the near impossibility of speaking from the molten core of the catastrophe. I seem to be just coining phrases here, and sometimes they ring a little hollow in my head, but I hope they won't ring hollow in your head. It's a poem as its one of its central images, the idea of an orchestra playing at Auschwitz. Celan wrote this poem right in 1944. He himself wasn't in Auschwitz, but he might as well have been. His effort in this poem was to give a voice to Jews who were in Auschwitz, or any victims of that sort. And the incredible, mind-boggling fact, which he became aware of in 1944, is that there were orchestras in the deaths. They were made up of all the fiddlers and other players who were there, because God knows there were more than enough of them in Jewish Europe. And they played at executions, at grave digging, at torture. They played in the morning when people went out to work, and played in the evening when they came back, to keep them in step. They played for the SS and for the Commandant, and so on. I've shown you here a picture of one of the smaller orchestras in Dachau playing while a condemned fellow prisoner was being taken to his death. Here's another one. Orchestra in the Lvov ghetto playing a song called Death Tango, which is one of the early titles Ceylon actually used for this poem, not Death Fugue, but Death Tango. What I'll do is I'll read the poem in English, and then I'll let you hear his voice reciting the last stanza of it. And there isn't an awful lot you need about this poem, except you will recognize two names in it. One of them is Margareta, and the other is Shulamit. I think I will read the poem aloud in my translation. Margareta is a German name, but more particularly it's the name of the heroine, the tragic heroine of the greatest work in German, if not European literature after Dante, namely Goethe's Faust. And so Margareta would be the Nordic, Germanic, and par excellence. Shulamit, on the other hand, is the maiden in the Song of Songs, the most beautiful love poetry in the Bible. Kisses sweeter than wine, belly like a heap of wheat, and so on. And so these two women figures come up opposite each other and sort of run tandem throughout the poem. The voice that you hear then is a plural we, as if Ceylon were giving voice to prisoners in a death camp. And then you hear the voice of the commandant, who is the man who lives in the house, and those are the only voices that you hear. Death Fugue. Black milk of daybreak, we drink it at evening, we drink it at midday and morning, we drink it at night, we drink and we drink. We shovel a grave in the air, there you won't lie too cramped. A man lives in the house, he plays with his vipers, he writes as dark to Deutschland, your golden hair, Margareta. He writes it and steps out of doors and the stars are all sparkling. Hair, Shulamit. We shovel a grave in the air, there you won't lie too cramped. He shouts, jab this earth deeper, you lot there, you others, sing up and play. He grabs for the rod in his belt, he swings it, his eyes are so blue. Jab your spades deeper, you lot there, you others, play on for the dancing. Black milk of daybreak, we drink you at night, we drink you at midday and morning, we drink you at evening, we drink and we drink. A man lives in the house, your golden as har, Margareta, your ashen as har, Shulamit. He plays with his vipers. He shouts, play death more sweetly. This death is a master from Deutschland. He shouts, scrape your strings darker. You'll rise then as smoke to the sky. You'll have a grave then in the clouds. There you won't lie too cramped. Black milk of daybreak, we drink you at night. You at midday, death is a master aus Deutschland. We drink you at evening and morning, we drink and we drink. This death is ein Meister aus Deutschland, his eye it is blue. He shoots you with shot made of lead, shoots you level and true. A man lives in the house, your golden as har, Margareta. He looses his hounds on us, grants us a grave in the air. He plays vipers and daydreams. Der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland. Dein goldenes Haar, Margareta. Dein aschenes Haar, Shulamit.
Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken dich nachts, wir trinken dich mittags, der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland. Wir trinken dich abends und morgens, wir trinken und trinken. Der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland, sein Auge ist blau. Er trifft dich mit bleierner Kugel, er trifft dich genau. Ein Mann wohnt im Haus, dein goldenes Haar, Margarete. Er hetzt seine Rüden auf uns, er schenkt uns ein Grab in der Luft. Er spielt mit den Schlangen und träumet. Der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland. Dein goldenes Haar, Margarete. Dein aschenes Haar, Shulamit.
We could talk more about that if you like. I'll say only about it to draw out this theme of the thwarted yet profound presence of Scripture in the Bible and how it was necessary to turn it back on itself. The way I hear the basis in the beginning, we drink you at evening and morning, we drink and we drink. drink you at midday, we drink you at night. And those words, evening, morning, day, and night, which ring in the beginning and all throughout Celan's poem, are the words that ring and that form the book of Genesis chapter 1. And it was that God saw the light and called it day, and he saw the darkness and called it night, and there was evening and there was morning one day. Creation itself, but for Celan, it must be called destruction or anti-destruction in his poem. And that's the force of the Bible, to take the founding text and to countermand it, to say no anymore, but in that same idiom. Of course, he was using Luther's German. And also the word Shulamit, posed opposite against the Nordic ideal, comes straight out of the most cherished book in the Bible, I suppose, the Song of Songs. So I won't say any more now, and instead close with a little bit of Hebrew poetry, as I said that I would, those three privileged languages, as it were, Yiddish, German, and Hebrew. I would mention very briefly, before I close, one short poem in Hebrew by Amir Gilboa, who was born in 1917. It's simply called Yitzchak, or Isaac. And I don't have to say the story of Isaac to remind you that during the Holocaust and during all the crusades and pogroms throughout Jewish history, the story of Isaac, so-called sacrifice of Isaac, or as Jews put it, the binding of Isaac, because he wasn't really sacrificed, the story of Isaac forms the touchstone. You might call it a shock absorber, because it was capable of absorbing all the shocks of history. It served as a kind of ruling, presiding, that the people was almost cut off, eradicated at the root. Isaac is the root of the Jewish people. Almost eradicated at the root. So drastic is that story, but saved at the last minute. And then you look at a poem like this, written in Israel just after the war by someone who saw his own family in the Ukraine, including his father, murdered, or who knew of that. Here's a poem entitled Yitzhak, but look at what it does. A knife flashed between the trees, and I'm so scared of the fear in my eyes. Daddy, Daddy, come quick and save Isaac, so no one will be missing at lunchtime. And then the father says, it's I who am butchered, my son. My blood's already on the leaves. Just to quote the heart of it. And so what's happened there is not only is someone sacrificed, but the father himself is murdered, the poet's father. And so the whole sort of saving grace of that story in the Bible, the story of Isaac, founding force of it, is choked in the throat and turned round, as in this poem. And finally, if Celan's poem, Death Fugue, is the most monumental poem to have emerged, here's the shortest poem by Don Pagis. You actually have the English in front of you. Don Pagis, I won't say much about him except that German was his mother tongue, and then he moved to Palestine and learned Hebrew and became a leading Israeli poet in Hebrew. Pagis wrote a very short poem. I'll say it in English, I'll let you hear it in Hebrew, and maybe I'll stop right there, because I think that it catches in the fewest words imaginable the crux, if that's the right word, the heart of the question at its most intractable, its most difficult, but at the same time at its most open-ended. Because here he takes something as close to the creation story as possible, namely the mother of us all, Eve, Adam, Abel, who was murdered by Cain, and in these few words in English and in Hebrew, he asks, I think, an unanswerable question, although that doesn't make it any the less necessary a question. Written in pencil in a sealed boxcar. Written in pencil in a sealed railway car. Here in this transport, I, Eve, with Abel, my son. If you see my older son, Cain, son of Adam, tell him that I... And then what you'll hear in a moment in his voice in German is, Katuv behi paron bakaron hechatum. כאן במשלוח הזה אני חווה עם הבל בני. אם תראו את בני הגדול, קין בן אדם, תגידו לו שאני...
Written in pencil and a sealed railway car. כתוב בעיפרון בקרון החתום. כאן במשלוח הזה חווה עם הבל בני. אם תראו את בני הגדול, קין בן אדם, תגידו לו שאני...
I think I'll stop there and we can talk as much as you like. Thank you.
As usual, I will field the questions. Or other remarks. Renee.
About which word? Oh, Schlüssel. Yes, you're asking about the word Schlüssel in the very first poem, which means... That's
I'm sorry, would you ask that again?
Oh.
And I was just, the reason that I didn't hear it was because I was just asked to pass on to you the request that when you stand up so that they can see you.
I'll repeat the question. Is the word that I translate as key, changing your key changes the word, the key that unlocks the house of what's silenced, etc. Is that the same as a musical key? I think German has another word for that.
It's Tonschlüssel, same word.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Tonschlüssel. So that's a beautiful thought in its way, although I think when he talks about unlocking the house, it's probably this kind of key that he primarily, in what you're thinking, as a kind of lingering overtone, so to speak.
Gene?
Would you comment on two things? The actions of the expatriate artists, musicians, poets in the 20s, and also more on the underground aspect of the art. This was a major chronology of brutality done in Italy.
So that was a question, I think, about the artists, expatriate artists and writers of the 1920s in this country.
No, I was thinking about France.
You mean, Americans who went to France?
No, the Germans, all of those who got engaged in this lead, I think, was 30.
Clay? You mean, Tony? Yeah. I'm not sure that I can do that right now off the cuff. What do you think its relation to the talk today was?
I've seen, I don't remember the name of this talk, I've read something about they were very outspokenly anti-Nazi.
Oh, sure, yes, yeah. Well, Brecht would be a very good example of that, and in Paris, as far as I know, but elsewhere. People who are lucky enough or savvy enough, canny enough to get out before 1933, 5, 8, when have you, 40, the very latest, lived elsewhere, whether it was Paris or it could have been any number of places, England, the United States, Los Angeles, and they did all kinds of things. Many of them continued their art as they knew it, and that art may or may not have had something to do with the oppression that they had escaped or that they were witnessing war. In the case of Brecht, it had everything to do with it. In the case of Schoenberg, a great Jewish artist in the West Coast and elsewhere, at times it had more and more to do with it, and at other times it didn't. In the case of Hermann Broch, you would say that it did in Princeton. So I think that there's another whole spectrum of possibility there. In the case of Hindemith, a great expatriate because he was married to a Jew. I'm not sure that his music shows all that much the trace of what was going on to people like his wife in Europe. I'm not sure that it does. So I think that in the case of Nabokov, though that's a very different case, It doesn't show it. Samuel Beckett is a wonderful case in point. Not that he was an expatriate, but he was a great Holocaust writer. Most people don't consider him that, but I think that he was. In the case of Samuel Beckett, I think that every word he wrote towards the end of the war and afterwards was permeated with the knowledge of what he had almost suffered from and what his friends were living through. So it's a fascinating and huge topic, which I think I'll just have to leave at that and say that all things happen, from the most direct, like Brecht and Schoenberg's Survivor from Warsaw oratorio, to business as usual, however good or bad.
Yeah, Paul, and then this lady here.
There are a lot of things going on in your question about lyric poets and what became of them during the war and after the war. So you're saying two different things. How did their language change and so on? I forgot to tell you, or rather I neglected deliberately to tell you, that Don Pagis' poem that I ended with, which seems to emerge, as I said, right from the molten core, here in this transport. That's a hic et nunc, as we say. That's a here and now with a vengeance. In fact, took him 25 years after the end of the war to write. It wasn't published till 1970. And yet, such is the way and the need of memory that he had to hark back, and this most signature poem, just as Paul Celan's poem that I started with and Death Fugue are signature poems, this most signal poem of Pagis's took him 25 years to come up with, and yet he had to set it right back at the very medias res, as we say, the middle of things. So the whole question of poetry after the war and its relation to what happened earlier is an immense, complex, and endlessly rewarding one, if I can use that term. But what happened during the war, that's an awfully large question. Yeah, let's take Sutzkever. A strange name, but Sutzkever would have been, and Paul Celan himself, who was younger, would have been a lyric poet of minor proportions, perhaps, or medium proportions, had it not been for what intervened, almost like a hatchet blade or a chasm is. And political isn't even a strong enough word for the kind of poet that the catastrophe turned them into a historical poet of a sort of deep modernist conviction, like Eliot or Robert Lowell or Pound or Joyce. So many people were made into the most profoundly political poets imaginable, but they never left behind, if they were already poets or they had a sense of the lyric calling, they never left behind the potential for joy and energy, form and euphony and music that lyric poetry carries with it. And this is what makes this poetry of Celan's and others so gripping to me, is that you find always this dynamic at work within it, the energy and the elation and that come with formal beauty, as against the banefulness, the fatality of the content of the poems. Yeah, you had your...
Could you remember to stand up, please, for the camera? Thank you.
Yes.
The first time I saw that, I sort of assumed that I had a limited working definition of barbaric. And where I went with that was discovering other meanings, as in new and radical. And that made sense to me, that a poetry or any kind of art coming out of this kind of event, in that sense, would have to be barbaric, it would have to be radical, it would have to have a new
Wow. Yeah. pejorative. There was a very strong pejorative sense. Yeah. So your question has to do with the quote by Adorno after Auschwitz: "To write a poem is barbaric." What he could have meant, and what could possibly for us be meant by the word barbaric. Maybe a lot more than I was getting at, because I said that he meant it pejoratively. That he was saying to get the kind of joy that affords, not just about Auschwitz, but after Auschwitz, is barbaric because you are, in a sense, battening, you know what I mean, feeding parasitically on the horror, and therefore doing a immense injustice to it. But you were very thoughtfully suggesting something more. Now, hidden within that word barbaric, it just occurs to me now, is more of that pejorative sense, because what was Hitler's move to the east called, after all, when 1941, the Hitler-Stalin Pact, and began to do away systematically in June, July 41 with most of Eastern Jewry, it was called Operation Barbarossa. And I don't know where Barbarossa got his name, but or whoever he was, but maybe his beard, but he had a kind of barbaric beard. So partly we would keep that negative sense of barbaric. But now you're saying that whether or not we want to credit it to Adorno, he may have been really radically renovative and forward-looking, as if to say that any poetry after Auschwitz is going to have to be, well, wild. Is the word barbaric a sort of term nowadays? Like, that's wild, man, that's barbaric? Not quite. But like savage or barbaric or wild in some slang, some really shocking slang sense of unheard of, out of human ken, you know, beyond normal civilized barriers. Terrific thought. Now, I hesitate to credit Adorno with that, but I think for you it's a terrific thought.
Yeah, this young lady down here.
You're referring back to the question of music in the Holocaust, which is part of my larger question of art and music, which contains, before I come back to your terrific question, an anecdote which I should have had in here, and it's almost enough to take home with you. Picasso, I often call, there's a big digressive balloon growing outside of the right side of my mouth here, and I'll come back to home base. We know about Picasso, and if there's anything of Picasso's we know, it's Guernica, Guernica, the Spanish town in 36, 37 that was bombed by the sort of pre-fascist bombers as a trial run for the Holocaust, or for the war, I should say. I often call in my more facile moments Celan's death fugue the Guernica of poetry, because I think that it is. In any case, Picasso painted this tremendous, surreal, distorted, violent image of the truth, the inner truth of war, in Paris in 1940 when it was occupied, but he was famous enough to be unharmed. He had that painting against the wall of his studio one day when an SS officer visited to see what the great painter was like, and noticed that painting in the wall, gestured to it, and asked Picasso, "Did you do that?" And Picasso is reputed to have said, "No, you did." And that anecdote, to me, practically stops the breath in my voice, because if you're interested in history and in art and the conjunction and that sometimes barely holds them together, that anecdote can give you enough to think about. So, Catherine, about Babi Yar, Shostakovich's symphony Babi Yar, which was based on Yevtushenko's poem of 1961, the 20th anniversary of the massacre at a ravine near Kiev called Babi Yar, when 33,000 Jews were machine gunned to death. Yevtushenko wrote the poem. Later, Shostakovich, the great modernist Russian composer, heard about it and composed a symphony which Yevtushenko recited the poem to in its opening. And I keep talking here, and I've still haven't come back to your question, which was what? Yes. Was that a good example? Is Shostakovich, or is any music like that? Other Shostakovich or Benjamin Britten's War Requiem, or Leonard Bernstein's Kaddish, or Messiaen's Quartet for the End of Time, or Schoenberg's from Warsaw, or you probably have examples in your head. These are the great ones that come to mind, and since music is the extreme form of poetry, right? What is lyric poetry? What is the lyre but a form of music? If music is the extreme purest form of poetry, then that makes the question even more difficult. How can music have anything to do? And yet, if you heard that Gideon Klein, I could almost sing it. I've heard it so many times now. The Slow Moves Trio a few days before his death, reminiscing on a Moravian folk song that he was sung when he was a child. You know that in some way, if our minds are sort of patient and deep enough, the music and the history, the music and the insult to humankind can come together. But with music, it's hardest.
I need to ask a question about one of your three privileged languages, namely Yiddish. Of course, Yiddish speakers were exterminated, and the culture that they grew up in was largely or almost totally obliterated. What is the current status? You played us a recording of a Yiddish poet reciting in Yiddish. What is the current status of the Yiddish language in various important places where I assume it is spoken or maybe still spoken, in particular in Israel and in the United States, and if it is still spoken there, in Europe?
Well, there'd be the long, the medium, and the short answer to I can answer that because I think about it and read about it a lot. And a lot of people, much more responsible than I am, do things about it too. Well, if it's a dying language, it has a long half-life, let's put it that way. And there are even times when some people here and there, most of them live in Brooklyn or thereabouts, think that it may not be a dying language, but a language somewhat on the rebound. And we go on and on about that, but it's spoken by very few people, and even far fewer people write or sing or converse, write or sing in it. But I would say that it will never quite die out. It'll have a kind of asymptotal relationship to its, what is that the word that I mean? That is, it'll approach a vanishing point, but never reach it. A lot of young people in the United States, in France, a little bit in Germany, not all that many in Israel, oddly enough, but in the United States, young people and not so young people are holding on tenuously to Yiddish because they feel it's the only lifeline, really the umbilical cord, because the mouth and the voice are the umbilical cord for people who care about speech and breath. It's the only lifeline back to this, what Philip very aptly called a nearly, I wouldn't use the word exterminated, because that's in a sense the oppressor's language, but people. Sutzkever recorded that poem not that long ago, and he still edits the major Yiddish poetry magazine coming out of Tel Aviv, but I would say that it has a very attenuated, tenuous life, but that it will go on for a long, long time.
Are there courses in Yiddish that are currently available for people to learn it who didn't grow up with it?
Oh, yeah. If not at Sonoma State, then they're at many, 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 many other places. There are summer programs. A great revival is in music, klezmer music. Klezmer music is kind of Jewish jazz with a lot of Middle and Eastern European roots, and its songs are all sung in Yiddish. I mean, they could be sung in other languages too, but they belong originally in Yiddish. So it's getting a kind of afterlife there too.
Sylvia?
The National Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts is building a huge center as we speak. So obviously, if they're putting up this center and collecting many, many thousands
Right.
of Yiddish books, there must be a reason.
Yeah. So one place is near Amherst, Massachusetts, called the National Yiddish Book Center. I just happened to grab a bag that says books or Bücher on it from there. Yeah, yeah.
You can go to New York in the summer to study Yiddish at Evil, which is connected, it's the Yiddish Institute, just connected with Columbia University. And it's just a course for about 5 weeks, so the whole level is intermediate.
Yeah. Yiddish was for many Jews in Germany and elsewhere a despised language because they felt it was beneath them. It was their poor, sort of squalid, mired in the past Jewish brethren whom they'd rather just sort of keep to one side. And what astonished me in looking closely into Paul Celan's poetry, Celan, who grew up speaking Hochdeutsch, high German, very beautiful German, as you could hear in his voice. What astonished me was the ways now and then that little Yiddish threads, little golden threads, showed up in his poetry, as if he, like Kafka, who was another person who rediscovered the Jewish language towards the end of his life, how Celan were trying to weave a few threads of that language back into his poetry in one way or another.
We're actually out of I have to make one remark before we all split up, and that is that that John's book on Paul Celan is available outside the door here for you to buy and for him to sign. I assume that you're interested in doing that. Yeah. So thank you very much. It just came out in paperback.
So what was your next question going to be? Or thought? Answer.
All the Orthodox.
Of course, yes. Yeah.
And they have 8 to 10 kids. They speak
Hi. Oh, an approval, by all means.